Check, 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 check. Talking, talking, talking.
Good morning. Please welcome to the stage the Atlantic's Margaret Lowe.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I'm Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live, and we bring the Atlantic's journalism to life to stages across the country, and we are so glad to be here in New York with all of you to grapple with one of the most urgent issues of our time, water, and all the vulnerabilities associated with water. And in many ways, although you can't see it anymore, you probably saw it as you walked in, this city is the perfect backdrop for this conversation. New York would not be New York without the harbor, the Hudson River, and the East River. This is geography that helped power this city's ascent, and yet New York is also so exposed because it is surrounded by water. Just last week, the federal government issued a special report about the immediate perils of climate change. And among other dire conclusions, the report makes abundantly clear the toll that rising seas will take on places like New York, where nearly 250,000 residents live in areas at risk of flooding. And those numbers mean that this city is more at risk than any other city in the country. And beyond this country, flooding and drought will impact the health and well-being of nearly every person on this planet. There is a lot to unpack today. Today, we will hear from city leaders and planners, environmentalists and activists to discuss the water issues of the moment, from preparing for bigger storms here and across the country to protecting clean drinking water around the world. And before we begin, I do want to take a moment to thank our underwriters. This event would not be possible without their support, so please join me in thanking Nestle Waters North America and the World Wildlife Fund. Thank you. Some practical notes, too. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away, because we would love you to join the conversation on Twitter. We're at AtlanticLIVE and using the hashtag AtlanticWater. And with that, let's begin with a look at local government's role in preparing for the challenges this city faces when it comes to water. For that, please welcome Marisa Lago, Director of the New York City Department of City Planning. Welcome. Vincent Sapienza, Commissioner of the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And Janie Bavishi, she is Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Welcome, Janie. And here to lead the conversation, please welcome journalist and author Kathleen Cope. Kathleen.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning, everyone. And you know, I think that Margaret teed this up perfectly for us. The National Climate Assessment came out on Black Friday. What an interesting day to release it to, huh? Coincidence. But I was reading it as not all 1,656 pages, but what I could plow through on the train coming up here yesterday, and getting more depressed by the mile. Janie, I'd like to go to you to get your opinion. What is your take on its projections? Some of what I guess we really did already know. Rising sea levels, increasing storms of greater severity, like Sandy, and then the impact that it's going to have on our economy, on our residents' health and well-being.
Yeah, well, thank you both, Margaret and Kathleen, for bringing up the National Climate Assessment. As you mentioned, it was released on Black Friday. Clearly, it was released at a time when most people weren't paying attention, so we must be talking about it, and I appreciate you raising it. For us in New York City, the National Climate Assessment really confirmed a lot of what we already know.
Because you have your own panel of scientists that looks at this constantly, right? That's
absolutely right. We have a mayorally appointed independent panel of scientists that produce local climate projections every 3 years around along a range of risks. So we get projections on sea level rise, storm surge, intense precipitation, extreme heat, both extreme events and chronic impacts. This is a panel that's actually required by local law, so it will continue beyond administrations. And so we have the privilege of working with this information on a regular basis. It's really the foundational information on which our $20 billion resilience program is based. But as you mentioned, you know, the National Climate Assessment confirmed a lot of what we already know. Sea level rise rise will, of course, be a major challenge that we in New York City and really coastal cities across the country will have to address. Here in New York City, we're planning for about 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise by the 2050s. But we also know that we have to address other risks of climate change. Extreme heat is actually one of the deadliest disasters that the city faces. We expect the days above 90 degrees to triple by the 2100s here in New York City. And intense precipitation is likely to rise 4 to 11% by the 2050s. In terms of the impact on the economy, Hurricane Sandy, which most of you know, hit New York City in 2012, and it caused $19 billion in damages and economic losses here in the city. We know that the same storm later this century would cost $90 billion in damages and economic losses. So, we're not waiting for Washington, D.C. to help us. We're leaning forward on these issues, and we've been implementing a multi-layered resilience approach to upgrade our buildings, make our neighborhoods safer, make sure that we're protecting and hardening critical services and infrastructure, and protecting our 520 miles of coastline here in New York City.
You know, the report brought up something no one really likes to talk about, and that's retreat. It said the potential need for millions of people and billions of dollars of coastal infrastructure to be relocated in the future creates challenging legal, financial, and equity issues that have not yet been addressed. I mean, is that even part of the equation in a city like New York?
Well, there will be places where we won't be able to keep the water out, and we have to start thinking about living with water. And after Sandy, there were buyout programs that the federal government, the state government, and the city sponsored in order to consider the possibility or provide the option of people moving to safer places. We've learned a lot of lessons from those programs, and I think that we'll continue to apply those lessons and think about strategies for making sure people are living in safe areas.
And if I might jump in here.
Sure.
We have in 3 neighborhoods in Staten Island and 2 neighborhoods in Queens that were particularly hard hit by Sandy, engaged in extensive public outreach, and have mapped through zoning special coastal risk districts that very, very severely restrict the amount of development that can occur, because Sandy spoke so clearly and the communities agreed that these were not areas where we would be encouraging growth.
You know, Vincent, I mean, it was after Sandy that FEMA redrew the flood maps that it hadn't redrawn in decades, and you learned that you had some 400,000 residents in New York City living in the 100-year floodplain. And I think we've seen around the country how 100-year floods, oddly enough, or the 500 or the 1,000-year ones, happen more frequently than every 100 years, as in Ellicott City, Maryland recently, right? So talk to us about what you're doing specifically to address that risk.
And so first, just to introduce what New York City DEP is, we're primarily the water and sewer utility for New York City. And I think, over the last few decades, we've done a really remarkable job at improving the local waterways, the Hudson River, East River, Jamaica Bay, and that's encouraged more people to move towards the waterfront for both recreation and living. And so that just brings challenges for us as to, both servicing them, but protecting them and protecting city infrastructure from both surge, sea level rise, and more intense storms.
So if I could also note, you mentioned the 400,000 people living within the 1%. To dimension that, that is a population that is the size of the city of Minneapolis. And when we think about what does that look like, it's not one size fits all, because there are the gleaming towers that we see across the river here. That's one building type. There are single family homes where the owners are able to relocate. But we also have very large communities that are lower income communities, and where this low-lying 1% floodplain provides an affordable housing resource. And so I raise that just to say that it cannot be one uniform solution, and it has to be a solution that is informed by tremendous outreach to the community, which is what the 3 of us do every day.
And it is so tough in a city like this, because you're grappling with, you've got 520 miles of shoreline, and you've got aging infrastructure, aging buildings, and as you said, so many communities that are very diverse and face different levels of risk. And also, I think it was interesting what you pointed out. I think the study found this as well, that throughout the country, it does often seem to be the less advantaged members of the community who are at greater risk.
One of the best tools I think that we have is our comprehensive waterfront plan. The city first adopted the requirement for this plan in 1993, so way before Sandy. It gets updated every 10 years. Our next one is due out in, I believe, 2022. And the plan is developed through a waterfront management advisory board that has 16 public members and then a host of city agencies. So we have just kicked off the latest update, and this will be an opportunity to take what is already a comprehensive plan, but add two key new features. One is, as Janie mentioned, incorporating the lessons that we've learned post-Sandy. But the second is having an equity lens, which is important to everything that we do in our city, including access to the waterfront and how we protect ourselves from climate change.
Janie, on that point, back to Sandy, how much does that disaster inform what the city does every day, what you do every day? I mean, is it really that perspective baked into every action you take?
Well, certainly we want to take a resilience lens across everything we're doing. And a good example of that is just earlier this year, we released version 2.0 of our climate resilience design guidelines, which take our local projections for intense precipitation, sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme heat, all of these hazards that New York City faces, and actually provide guidance to designers and engineers on how to incorporate those projections into the design and construction of all of the city's capital projects, so that we're not thinking about resilience projects in a silo. We're not just thinking about the flood wall or the tidal gate, but rather thinking about how we bring a resilience lens to every investment that we're making.
And I might build on that as well. In addition to the design guidelines, right after Sandy, the city adopted emergency zoning regulations that allowed people who wanted to rebuild to elevate their buildings and not lose usable space. So if they elevated their buildings to the flood level, they could add those extra feet on top of their buildings. We are now on the verge of starting the public review process for a citywide zoning for resiliency, which takes the lessons that we've learned. Which takes the lessons that we've learned and incorporates them into our zoning. And so again, it has just become a fact of life that resiliency, sustainability, and equity inform what we do as a government.
So could you talk to us about some specific projects that are underway that they, either are nearing completion or just starting out? Just give us an idea of what you're doing to help specific communities manage this risk.
So there's a lot of city infrastructure that's right along the shoreline, and so both lessons from Sandy and the information that we're getting out of Janie's shop, with help from other city agencies, is doing a lot of things, hardening, elevating equipment. We've done a lot of that recently. We have a lot of pumping stations around the city that are close to the shoreline that took direct hits from Sandy. All of that electrical equipment now we're raising above flood levels, and we've done a bunch of that. We have about $300 million more work for DEP budgeted, but retreating where necessary. If we have facilities that are due for an upgrade, maybe they're in the wrong location. So those are some of the things we're also looking at.
The other thing that we've done is to arm businesses so that they can protect themselves. We recently, from the Department of City Planning, put out a resilient industry report. And what we did is look at different types of businesses and made suggestions for low-cost interventions that they could consider to protect themselves. It was well received because it wasn't mandatory. It didn't say you had to do this, but it gave examples of what one could do.
Janie, how important is it throughout this process to make sure that you are really including the residents of New York, that they have a voice, that they are a part of this process? Because I think whether you're recovering from a disaster or trying to build in more resilience, what I've found in working with communities around the country on this topic is that people support what they build. And if they don't have a role in building it, they may not support it.
Well, I think Marisa already mentioned this, but it's absolutely critical to include residents as part of the process. And I think that's, we've been talking about the comprehensive waterfront plan. The mayor's strategic plan is actually documented in the One NYC report, which we're actually also in the process of updating now. And it has 4 visions: resilience, sustainability, equity, and economic growth. So it's a chance to really think about the balance of all of those 4 lines of work that are so critical to the city. But community engagement is absolutely critical to all of that being a success.
So you have community meetings and people can come in and say, hey, I like this, I don't like that.
Certainly, and even more than meetings, we have charrettes, we have planning processes where community members are absolutely engaged and at the table. This is really a chance for us to reimagine our waterfront and to think about how we are balancing the need to protect our communities with all the other uses that we rely on our waterfront for, whether it's recreation or public access or transportation. And Marisa can certainly speak to this as well. But you know, it's absolutely critical that we're engaging communities, and they have a strong voice at the table, leading the discussion on what that looks like.
I'd weigh in on this by noting that I said we're on the verge of beginning the public review of a comprehensive zoning for resiliency. Even before the very formal 7-month public review process begins, we've already engaged in over 100 community meetings. We've produced this fabulous map of planning for resiliency that gives examples of different approaches to protecting ourselves. But I think the other thing that Janie mentioned that's so important to highlight is we're focusing on the defensive, the protection. We also need to celebrate the waterfront. We're a city that was built because on our harbor. Our industry thrived, again, because of our harbor and the connection to the Erie Canal. For years, the waterfront was a working waterfront, which, with global changes, turned into, in many instances, an abandoned waterfront. If you look at our city today, we have thriving maritime industries. Look at the west coast of Staten Island. We have industries that are dependent upon having access to the Newtown Creek Canal. But we also have, because zoning that was put in place in 1994, a requirement that any redevelopment that occurs in a residential or commercial zone, except for 1- and 2-family houses, has to include access to the waterfront. And as a result of that, we have scintillating new public access points to the waterfront paid for by the private sector. And the city itself has put in place, in the last quarter century, 65 new public parks. And so people think of our waterfront differently. With the advent of the ferry service in all 5 boroughs, we now think of ourselves as a city connected by ribbons of blue, not just by our subways and buses. And this has been a fundamental reorientation of how we think of ourselves as a water city.
Speaking of New York being a water city, you do have the largest water and sewer system, correct, in the entire country. Yeah. And Vincent, as you look at the steps you've taken since Sandy to harden it, to make it more resilient, how does New York compare to the rest of the country that maybe hasn't faced a disaster like you did, hasn't had that wake-up call?
Right. So we've done, a lot of hardening, but just climate change in general presents a lot of challenges for us. And, we typically think about storm surge events, but we're seeing more rainfall, heavier rainfall, we call cloud bursts here locally. And our sewer system was designed for certain capacities. As we're getting more rainfall, it's harder to drain the primarily paved streets in the city. And so we've been doing a bunch of other things, a lot of investments in new storm sewers. Mayor de Blasio allocated $1.9 billion of new storm sewers just for Southeast Queens, and we're well underway in that. But we're looking to green, I guess, the urban landscape. So we've been doing things like curbside rain gardens, bioswales, and other types of infrastructure to have the ground actually soak up those heavy rains before they get into the sewer system.
I guess what I was asking too, though, is do you speak to your peers about, hey, look, here's what we learned, and you need to be getting ready? I just find that when it comes to disaster, often the best evangelists are those who've been through it, the best evangelists for preparation. Yeah,
I think there are a lot of communities throughout the country that have woken up to these things. A lot of the challenges, though, are just funding. A lot of infrastructure in many communities are old. They're looking more at their drinking water side lately than some of the storm drainage and collections issues and protecting those assets. So funding is certainly a challenge for many municipalities.
But also,
To your point about other cities, it would be odd to go more than 2 weeks without having a visiting delegation because we're New York City. And so we have delegations of mayors, we have delegations from foreign countries, and we view that as part of our responsibility to share our experiences and also to learn from the delegations because we don't have a lock on all knowledge.
and we also have, we're actively involved in networks of other cities that are taking leadership on climate action. So we're actively involved in 100 Resilient Cities. We also actively participate in the C40 network. On the cloudburst events that Vinny mentioned, we actually have a great partnership with Copenhagen. Copenhagen experienced a cloudburst event and came up with some strategies that they were interested that were working for them in Copenhagen. So we sent a delegation out there. They have been here. They are interested in learning from our coastal protection efforts. So we find those exchanges extremely fruitful.
Speaking of taking leadership, is it difficult? I know that the city does do so much, has its own panel of scientists, but when you're trying to move forward on these issues and you have an administration that is trying to dismantle and roll back environmental protections, regulations, does that make, and this question to any of you, does it make your job here harder? Does it hinder you in any way in protecting your city?
Of course, the assaults on the Clean Water Act perhaps are the most direct, but also on the Clean Air Act. I think what it does is it hardens our resolve. I would say that one of the biggest challenges we face, not directly related to water, is the assault on immigration. We're a city of immigrants. Over 60% of New Yorkers are either immigrants themselves or have at least one parent who's an immigrant. And so I think you've seen the city rise up as a sanctuary city. You've seen the city challenging the proposal to put a question on citizenship in the census. And so we're not sort of sitting back and being passive about it. We are aggressively challenging things that we're seeing coming from the federal level with which we disagree.
Let's go to questions now. I'm sorry I didn't give you all a heads up to be thinking about what you might want to ask my wonderful panel. And if you want another moment to think, I'll ask another question before we go to you. And we have a question here in the front. If you would, identify yourself, please. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Oh, I'll stand up. Sure. Hi, I'm Albert Golston, Cerulean Council. You spoke about, for example, cloudbursts and climate change as far as having too much water, etc. With climate change, you have also the other extreme in terms of drought. And a couple of cities worldwide have suffered, large cities, severe drought situations over an extended period of time, specifically Sao Paulo, Brazil, and in Cape Town. Are there any contingency plans or any planning efforts in anticipation that you basically could, here in New York, could run out of water?
It's interesting you mentioned that. The National Climate Assessment said your reservoir system was really in very good shape here. They cited New York as being an area that they didn't see as being a great risk. Unfortunately, where I live down closer to D.C., they said we could have issues because the Potomac River levels, where we get some of our water, they are expected to drop, so that could become a problem in the future. But would you like to add to what the climate assessment said?
Yeah, so the assessment for the Northeast is actually more rainfall as part of climate change. So our reservoirs currently are at 95% capacity. And I think in New York City, we're a little bit different. We're just fortunate that, for the last 7 generations now, since 1842, we've built out this network of reservoirs that have a capacity of 580 billion gallons of water. We use 1 billion gallons a day, so we've got an adequate supply.
But it's a great question. Thank you. And we have one back here.
Hi there, I'm Anthony Curry. I'm a journalist with Reuters Breaking Views. I'm going to make a bit of a hyperlocal point, and I will confess this kind of affects me because I live just up the street. It's about planning, and it involves resilience, and it involves the waterfront and access to it. And it's the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, maybe about to collapse. So the promenade down the street from us is probably going to become, instead of being a walkway, it's going to become a 6-lane highway, quite possibly, just after the lovely Brooklyn Bridge Park has been completed after 10 years. And it's fantastic. But it strikes me that planning really was missing there. Because the last thing you want to do is spend a great deal of money building this platform for the new highway when you could have used the waterway for a while. And grant you that these decisions go way back, but it just strikes me in general, without getting too boring for everyone else on a local point, but it worries me that when it comes to resiliency, planning still has to fit in with the regular issues that a city faces. And in this particular instance, it strikes me that New York City failed.
Marisa?
I'm glad you mentioned Brooklyn Bridge Park. It is something that is extremely near and dear to me. I grew up with my grandfather working on a tugboat in New York Harbor on the piers that today are Brooklyn Bridge Park. For most of my life, those piers were open, rotting places for drugs and prostitution. They contributed nothing to the city. And to see that planners had the vision and that government was willing to lead with financing to bring back those piers. They have a financially sustainable model because of development opportunities on the upland portions. Brooklyn Bridge Park is a runaway success, an example of what planning should be. Other boroughs are now saying, please give me my Brooklyn Bridge Park. Also, for anyone who hasn't been there, the diversity of the uses of the park, whether kayaking, whether basketball courts, whether passive recreation. A city has many needs, and clearly maintaining its infrastructure, in particular its interstate highway system, is essential. And I can assure you that the discussions about how the BQE will be reconstructed will take place in public with very, very lively input. And input not just from the nearby residents, but also from the park advocates, from the transportation advocates, and from the businesses who are dependent on the BQE to move goods and services around the city.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, right here.
Okay. Hi, Ellen Sabin, Watering Can Press. I have actually a really uninformed question, so excuse me.
Fire away.
But as someone who lives in Manhattan and has experienced sort of pre-Sandy, the oh my God drama of you live near 9th Avenue, here's what you need to do to protect your building or your townhouse or your whatever. What is the city doing to inform either building owners or townhouse owners or in advance to let them preemptively, not in the middle of drama, but preemptively, being a public health person, figure out what they should be doing to not just protect their asset, but also support the infrastructure?
Sure. So that's a great question. We have a campaign called Flood Help NY. You can find the website if you just Google Flood Help NY. That will provide you with technical assistance and counseling on ways to lower your national flood insurance premiums or just take steps to protect your home and your belongings.
Anyone else want to chime in? No? All right. We may have time for one more question on this side, and that'll be it.
Hi, my name is Millie Hawk Daniel. I'm with PolicyLink, and we launched, as part of many projects that we're doing, what we call the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, which has about 50 members from across the country. And the focus of this caucus is really to make sure that the needs of low-income communities and communities of color are not left out of this conversation. And it has to be included in multiple ways, and I'm curious to hear if, how New York is thinking about this. I live here. Our organization is based in Oakland, California. But when you think about the water issues and that are real concerns, the climate issues that are absolutely real concerns, but you also think about the housing concerns and the transportation concerns. And so what is the process for both engaging community and making decisions about, so if we have to move people out of public housing, where are we going to move them to? Many of them can barely afford what they're doing. Recognizing that we still have to deal with the climate issues.
All right. Thank you so much for raising that lens, because that underlies all that we do. And I'll give you just one very specific example. As I mentioned, we are updating the once every 10-year update of the city's comprehensive waterfront plan. There is a Waterfront Management Advisory Board. On that board, among the public members, are members whose focus is advocacy for low-income communities, and that is embedded in all that we do. Any major change to our zoning requires a 7-month process that requires having meetings in the community at the community board level, another public hearing at the borough level, another public hearing before the City Planning Commission where any member of the public can come and testify, and similarly a public hearing at the City Council. And we are a city that is not shy. These public hearings are well attended. They're frequently contentious because communities speak with many different voices, but I firmly believe we end up with better decisions and with a more equitable city because of this robust public process.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions, and please join me in thanking my terrific panel, Janie, Vinnie, and Marisa.
Next up, for a conversation about water infrastructure around the world, please welcome Jacqueline Ashmore, Executive Director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy, Kate Orff, founder of SCAPE, and Seth Siegel, author of Let There Be Water. Leading the conversation is Ray Suarez.
I think they want you here.
Okay.
Well, good morning. When you've got something as bland and undetailed as we've got a water problem, it doesn't come close to getting us where we need to be to start this particular conversation. Because depending on where in the world you're talking about, there are many places where there's too much, many places where there'll never be enough. At the same time, with both of those challenges for vast, almost unimaginable consequences for people entering those futures, because the models are not sturdy. The trajectory of these problems are not predictable. How do we prepare in a way that answers the challenges of Amman, Jordan, and Kano State in northern Nigeria at one end of the continuum, and Mumbai, Miami, and this densely packed collection of capital, New York, where we're sitting at the moment? Luckily, we have the people with the answers and 25 brisk minutes to elicit them all. To get us started, there are places in the world that have taken the measure of the challenge, put responses in place that make sense, gotten the public behind them. Are there leaders and laggards in this area? Jacqueline?
Great question and great framing. I guess one thing I'd comment on is that a very helpful way to think about these challenges can be around a framework to analyze what are the specific needs and challenges and what are the specific opportunities in a given place. My institute works a lot on integrated water management, and that really starts from the perspective that, at least here in the US, one of the very traditional ways of dealing with water has been incredibly siloed. So you have your potable water management system, which is very separate from your wastewater management, which is in turn separate from stormwater management. And if you step back and just think about the fact that water is water, whether it's dirty, clean, and you can really think holistically about that system. And then this framework gives you the chance to say, in our community, our biggest challenge is overall scarcity, overall deluge, or sometimes a good amount, but just it comes in bursts and it isn't kind of a steady natural supply that we experience. And also beyond kind of framing what are your biggest challenges, what are your biggest needs, what do you want to prioritize pursuing, bearing in mind all the stakeholders who are involved and affected by your water management. So that can bring in a vast group of people, including your watershed managers, so that you're conscious of your environmental impacts, right through to your end consumer. One of the great regions that has done a lot of work on this integrated water management is Australia. They've shown a lot of success. US water managers are noting that, and many of them are getting very involved.
Kate?
Well, when you're talking about types of water, I think one example that's often used when talking about kind of coastal threats is Holland or the Netherlands. But what I wanted to emphasize is the politics and the decision-making frameworks of all of these places relative to how effective managers can be. Holland's example is that, in response to massive flooding, well, of course, this is a country that is below sea level. There's a lot of kind of shared racial or ethnic background within this country. They were developed with a kind of series of water boards, so literally their governance was sort of structured around the issue of water, and they've moved from into a kind of through different paradigms. The first one was aggressively keeping water out, and now Holland is starting to move towards this paradigm of living with water, actually undoing some of the major locks and dams they built, trying to build with nature in terms of sand dunes and so on. But I guess I would just contrast that management regime with many of the other places that I've visited in the world and that you referenced in your remarks, like Mumbai, or places that around the world that are facing threats within that same spectrum, maybe not as existential threats, but have incredibly different governance structures. And I think that to me is going to be really where we need to start to focus our energy, our design energy, in some of these places that are incredibly threatened, but also maybe have less capital or social kind of cohesion or governance structures to enable these decisions to be made.
And finally, Seth, you've been looking more at scarcity than too much.
Yeah, I'd like to just reflect one way for the audience, and that is to say that that water is a very vast subject, and therefore you can be looking at it as the water we need to live our lives, drinking, cooking, sanitation, bathing. You can be looking at it as water for agriculture. You can be looking at water as a threat, rising sea levels, falling amounts of water in groundwater. You can be looking at it from many different ways, and I think it's very important for us to define our terms at all points as to what we're talking about, because otherwise water becomes sort of this just out there UFO that's hovering over us, and we don't really know where and how to deal with it. And just a quick comment about Kate's insight that I wanted to just share, which is that the book I wrote, Let There Be Water, and I'm working on another one now, maybe we can get it to later, but the book I wrote talks about how in the driest region of the world, in a place with fast-growing population, a country has figured out a way to have an abundance of water. The country is Israel. And I believe that the way that it's succeeded, aside from very smart uses of market forces and great amounts of technology, is the governance structure that we talked about. And that is to understand that frequently water is screwed up by politicians and by being involved in the political process, and that because water is so politicized, there are winners and losers, and politics is the allocation of resources, which makes some people better and some people worse off. What Israel made the decision to do was to completely take the water decision-making out of the hands of politicians. And there's a water authority that sits for a 5-year term and with a permanent staff, and everyone there is a technocrat and completely divorced from politics. And I think that is probably the great secret as to why they've been the success that they have.
One of the things that's tantalizing about this subject, and if you remember the myth of Tantalus, it'll work out as a metaphor, is that you're not trying to hit a stable target. The confidence that the civil engineers of a century ago brought into planning big things that would be online for a long time is no longer as easily present as people get together to talk about how to do big things. We don't know in a certain kind of way what's the situation's going to be in 2030, 2040 during the useful life of the things that we're planning today, and whether it's increasing over-reliance on irrigation water to replace rainfall, incursion of brackish water into arable land because of rising ocean levels, privatization of water supply by cash-strapped governments that can't keep up with the enormous challenges of population growth. Are there just basic social equity questions that are exposed by having to grapple with something like this? Sure, there's water if you can afford it.
I was just going to extend that and maybe build on that prior comment. That so in addition to being a founder of Scape, which is a landscape architecture firm, I'm the associate professor at Columbia, and over many, many years, I've taken students to cities around the world with water at the center, kind of looking at cities through the lens of water. And what you're, this sort of reference to brackish water, and I think what I wanted to emphasize is the interconnectedness of water. And yes, you have to break it down, but you kind of can't, because the way, one example is Can Tha in Vietnam, okay? So we have a situation where you have the water, energy, food nexus kind of coming into play. We have increasing number of dams being built on the Mekong upstream. And what's happening is you have salinization happening, so rice farmers, flying off the land, urbanization, and literally you're kind of seeing, it's hard to undo the world, but I think what's important in water is to really try to connect all those dots between rapid urbanization, agriculture, salinization, sea level rise, and literally the kind of the energy loop that we're in, because these dams are being made for hydropower, but they're actually cutting off fish stocks, which are affecting food and creating salinization. So I guess increasingly in cities that we visited around the world, you can begin to see the I don't know if you call it the downward spiral, but the interconnectedness and collapse of the water cycle in a much broader sense of the picture that you just described.
Seth and Jackie?
Ray, I think you make actually a profoundly important point in the question you ask. And that is that I really want to put a bright light around it for the audience in case it slipped by. And that is that for much of what we talk about with water, it is the idea of the fixed target problem is pervasive. So if you're talking about installing drip irrigation in a field somewhere in Karnataka in India, okay, so if you can adjust the flow and you can tear it out and it's not a great big cost. But if you look at the civil infrastructure for the water that we live, whether it's, and the book I mentioned earlier that I'm working on is now about America's drinking water and frankly the lamentable quality of it. And the reason for that is the fact that we built out systems from the 1880s mostly through called the post-World War II era, and we built out this really wonderful system that addressed all the problems for then and the scientific insights for then. And now we're facing a whole new world where we're going to be living with our new civil infrastructure that's going to be replacing what was. We're going to be living with it for 50 years, 75 years, maybe 100 years. And we don't really understand. Now what we understand is that the threats are coming at us fast and furious, but we don't really know what those threats are going to be. And therefore, we need to be able to figure out a way, maybe with great organizations like your work and your organization, to figure out ways of what those threats might be and how we can make the systems resilient enough that they could be responsive to those threats that are coming at us.
Jackie?
Resilience is absolutely a key term in terms of your comment on timeline and projections. A notable example in this space is City of Austin in Texas, which has just put together a 100-year water plan. And I see them, as well as other cities, really thinking about what's the mix of centralized versus decentralized infrastructure. What are the district-level solutions? What are the building-level solutions? You've got places like San Francisco and Minneapolis where they've really driven hard on what can we do at the building level. How do we enable those small-scale systems to contribute to our water management challenges and solutions? And I think that's potentially a really useful approach to consider.
Is there a point, could you even conceive of a point, where we just say to a Henderson County, Nevada, you're kind of done. Don't take on another 1 million people. You don't have water for them.
You do see cities making decisions. We work with another small but rapidly growing city, New Braunfels in Texas, and they have actually looked at certain businesses that want to come to town, realized how high their water consumption is, and said, sorry, but we just don't see this working. And so you are seeing that kind of supply question and consumption question factoring into that kind of decision making.
Because Americans are pretty allergic to that kind of heavy-handed message.
Can I say a word about that? Actually, I'm opposed to any authoritarian solution to our water problems. I'm opposed to population control. I'm opposed to prohibiting consumption of beef. I'm opposed to any things that get floated around, all those types of things. Opposed to banning new people moving into areas. I'm opposed to any of those things. The problem we have, particularly in the United States, but the problem we have is that we don't use market forces to make our judgments. On every other decision about our lives, how we buy our cars, how we take our vacations, where we live, market forces either influence or determine for us what we're going to do. In water, because it's so incredibly subsidized, and because there's such a disconnect between the real cost of water and I'm just talking about the environmental cost, the real actual economic cost of that water, because there's such a huge disconnect with that, that communities like Henderson, Nevada, are permitted to grow at a pace where they're not paying the real cost for their water. And if they had to do that, then I would say bring them on. Not 1 million, 10 million, as many as you want, as many as you can squeeze in there, go for it. Your own zoning rules, good luck. But don't ask others to subsidize your water consumption and your food choices and your family size. Everyone should pay their real rate. Obviously, poor people should be subsidized, like we do with subsidized food. But everyone who can afford to pay should be paying, and let market forces help shape the answer. And I think that's a key part that's out of the equation because, again, politics plays too large of a part in our water decision making.
Well, when you take students to some of these real pressure points in the world, when you take it out of the classroom and go see what's really happening in Rio, in Calcutta, in Amman, what do your students make of it? It's so removed from the experience that I'm going to guess many of them have grown up with.
It's a tremendous learning experience, and it's also incredibly helpful to do this comparative study. So one year we did take students to Amman, Jordan, and Calcutta, India, which actually kind of mirrors the topic of this panel of surge and scarcity. And literally the students within 4 days drew the water infrastructure and vulnerability of Amman's drinking water crisis, which is very politically partly in its origin relative to the channeling and the discrepancy and conflict over the Jordan River, another group was halfway around the world looking at surge and looking at the challenges of Calcutta. I will say one landscape and that was particularly inspiring to the students was the East Calcutta wetlands. And this is what I would call like an integrated landscape approach. I mean, people talk about technology or market fixes for water. I'm going to be someone who's going to talk about landscape strategies for water, forests, wetlands, etc. But the East Calcutta wetlands is literally a large zone of wetlands that essentially helps to filter the sewer water from urban water from Calcutta in a series of interconnected pools where vegetables are grown, where fish are cultivated, and that then feeds back into the city. So I think, I hate to talk about quick technology fixes for water because I think that's the opposite of what we need to do. I think we need to think at landscape scales. I think we need to invest in forests and wetlands. But this is an example of one landscape that I think students got extremely excited about because it's embedded in people's lives. It involved a production of, food and integrated water into agriculture, into all other kinds of, living and livelihoods. So people cared about it and sustained it.
We'll have time to take a couple of your questions in a moment, so be thinking of something that's elegant, brief, and actually a question. As you look down the road, is there inevitably going to be a lot of places in the world where this is going to have to be done with a gun to our head because the prudent decisions are not being made now in advance of us welcoming the 9 billionth person on the planet who has to be fed, who needs clean water to drink, to wash?
So the answer is I really hope not. The reason why I stepped out of my life, the reason I left my business career about 9-10 years ago was exactly to response to that question. I didn't see the issues everyone here is thinking about, but I saw water scarcity as a growing problem in large parts of the world. I saw that we could see huge humanitarian crisis and population flows before I knew about immigration crises, like what happened with the Syrian civil war and all that stuff. And I thought to myself, we really need to start thinking about solutions here. So my answer is that my book, the one I mentioned earlier, Let There Be Water, is actually an optimistic book because it shows that there are real-world solutions, whether you're a poor country or a rich country, whether you're a landlocked country or a country with a long seacoast, you have the opportunity to have very smart outcomes that will not lead you to the door of destitution and poverty and horror. On the other hand, although it is an optimistic book because we know there is a solution, and I show how it would work, the problem is that there is such bad governance in so many places, and because water problems are a proxy for bad governance, that you're going to see, I think, lots of places where there will be a crisis, a horrible crisis that's going to come, because by the time they realize they have to do something, it's going to be too late to move, and you're going to end up spending multiples of what you had to spend, and there won't be the cash available to do it. So I think that the wealthier countries can always buy their way out of the problem, but I think in lots of places around the world, we're going to be seeing some very, very horrible outcomes coming very soon.
Jacqueline.
I'll be totally honest and say that unfortunately we can't talk about these crises entirely in the future. We've had many problems in the past, and some very recently here in Flint, Michigan. I know we're talking about that later this morning, where we've just seen incredibly inadequate responses. Short spans of attention to a crisis, and then we move on to whatever the next problem is in the media. So unfortunately, we're already seeing many challenges. Similarly to Seth, what gets me out of bed every morning is trying to minimize the number of places that experience severe challenges. And I just feel part of my job is not just to go and do research and help people on the ground, but also to be out here communicating to everybody I know, including my friends who just turn on the faucet in the morning and brush their teeth without even thinking twice about everything that has to happen for potable water to be reliably coming out of their faucet in the morning. So I just believe that similarly to our energy challenges, we all have to spend as much of our thoughtful energy around, what do we do, what can we each individually bring to making sure other people understand this is a challenge, make sure we're working towards solutions.
There are roving mics, one there, and a questioner.
Yes, hello. My name is Terry Mendelson. I'm from True Cost Environmental Analytics, and I'd be interested in hearing from the panelists about innovation or technology that they're excited about that addresses issues of water quality and quantity.
Kate?
This isn't going to be what you're looking for, but I'm going to say forests. And I'm going to give you an example. And that is for example, I was in Maputo, Mozambique with WWF, one of the underwriters of this event. And we were looking at, when you talk about resilience, much more broadly at the scale of Mozambique, the challenges of water and extraction landscapes. And Maputo's entire drinking water is dependent on a forest that is mostly in Swaziland, and that forest is rapidly being deforested. So there is the pipe, the dreaded pipe, which, and there is this sort of means of transport, but that entire infrastructure, that hard infrastructure, is completely dependent upon an intact landscape that is functional. And so, I would, as much as I would love to say there's a special, pill that you can put in and everything's clean, I actually feel like we need to invest in these larger ecosystemic preservation projects, and that will help, preserve our groundwater and help kind of preserve this interconnectedness and biodiversity that we need to actually keep fresh water circulating in the world. But that's probably a different answer than.
I'll just, by the way, I want to second that. I would not have ever thought to say that, but I'm so glad that you said it, so that now I will now steal that answer from now on, because I get asked that. I get asked that question a lot. So now I'm gonna, without any credit to you, perhaps I'll just start using it. But I was in Sao Paulo recently, and as you may know, they had a horrific water crisis there. Basically, electricity was shut off of the city. It's a major world city, and the reason is they figured out was because they had been clearing the Brazilian rainforests, and the trees hundreds of miles away created this canopy of this river of water, this vapor that ended up descending onto Sao Paulo, and because they managed to clear cut so much of the forest, they left us. But to answer your question with, I think, what you meant by that, but I do love that answer. There are two technologies, one that's real and the other one which is fanciful. You're going to be hearing about the fanciful one later today. I saw the schedule. The one that's real is drip irrigation. I am a complete zealot about drip irrigation. I can't say enough great things about drip irrigation. It saves enormous amounts of water. It saves also on the degradation of soil and the degradation of water supply, because you can also feed the fertilizer and nutrients through the drip irrigation process, and therefore not have all the terrible nitrogen runoffs. So just in the interest of time, I won't say a lot more, but just drip irrigation is adopted in a tiny fraction of the worldwide irrigated fields, and we need to do more about that. India, by the way, is, God bless them, leading the charge on that because they understand how important that is. The fanciful technology is this atmospheric water generation, which I think is a speaker 1 or 2 panels from now. And it's still not proven. It's still somewhat energy intensive. But if it can come to the fore, it will just change civilization. Everybody will put one of these atmospheric generators on their roof of their houses, and overnight when it's moist in the air, it'll absorb all this fresh, pure water, and by the morning you'll have a tank full of water that is perfect.
I'm just going to talk about a set of technologies that enable various forms of reuse. So many of us irrigate our lawns at home with potable water. Why do we do that? We were talking last night, the way concrete is formulated relies on potable water. Why? So all those approaches that enable treatment and reuse, I think, can really be helpful to us as we think about different ways of managing our water.
And the tyranny of the clock is forcing me to ring this down. Unfortunately, we could go for another half hour. There's a lot more I want to ask you all. But please
let's do it anyway. We got the microphone.
That's true. That's true. Well, that's another kind of tyranny.
Who's going to take us off?
Thanks a lot, Seth Levine, author of Let There Be Water, Kate Orff, architect and founder of SCAPE, and Jacqueline Ashmore, executive director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
For a session produced by our underwriter, Nestle Waters North America, please welcome Matt Howard of the Water Council, here with Valeria Orozco, Director of Sustainability at Nestle Waters.
Fantastic. Matt, thank you so much for being here. And we're really excited to talk about the Alliance for Water Stewardship. But I think to kick us off, we really need to just have a level set. You know, what is AWS, Alliance for Water Stewardship? What's the standard? And, you know, why did WWF, TNC, Pacific Institute, and, you know, other companies come together to create it?
Sure, yeah. So show of hands, who's heard of the Alliance for Water Stewardship? That's going to help me out. Well, good.
Fantastic.
So the Alliance for Water Stewardship was formed actually about 10 years ago, and it was formed by really a very diverse group of water users, advocates, NGOs, to really help companies that had significant water risk in their direct operations and their supply chain to develop a coherent approach to address that risk. But not just to focus on internal process optimization and water use within the four walls and the fence line, but to really get those companies working with stakeholders, diverse stakeholders throughout the supply chain in a collaborative manner to address a lot of the water risk that really exists outside the fence line.
Right, great. And what are some of the unique features of the standard?
Yeah, it's great. I think one of the things that we've heard this morning is how highly hyper-local water-related issues are, right?
Exactly.
From basin to basin, watershed to watershed, municipality to municipality, water risk and water issues are different. So, you know, one of the key features of the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard is that it's flexible. And so it can be used in a water-scarce environment, where water quality is an issue, where regulatory risk is a significant issue. So flexibility was built into the standard. And the standard is really a process. And it helps companies work through a process of identifying how they're using water, where they're getting it from, and then based on that, in consultation with their stakeholders, developing a water stewardship plan for the site to really address those risks. But just as importantly, and this is the other unique feature, is to really do some collaborative actions outside the four walls with their stakeholders to address those shared opportunities and challenges that really emanate from stresses that are occurring with our water resources.
Exactly. I think that's one of the most exciting and interesting and powerful things about AWS. And, you know, the unique feature you mentioned right there about multi-stakeholder collaboration outside of the four walls of an operations. Can you share an example, or how is this actually done, right? How does AWS enable this? And how does it help businesses?
Great question. So I'm based in Milwaukee, so eventually my conversation has to get to beer, cheese, or the Packers. So I'll come on, people. That's my only joke. That's it. All right. So we're going to talk about beer. Miller Coors. So their flagship brewery is located in Milwaukee. They've been there about 150 some odd years. They're good corporate citizens. They're well known for their activities out in the community. They obviously use a lot of water, and they have a lot of water stress that's associated, with the brewing process and obviously the supply chain. One of the things that AWS helped them do, in addition to really put a more comprehensive management system approach in terms of dealing with quality issues as it related to the water source, it helped them connect their community efforts that they were doing with the community in Milwaukee with those quality efforts that are associated with stormwater runoff, polluted agricultural runoff that's getting into the tributaries and into Lake Michigan. And so it really just helped them be more intentional about those collaborative efforts, again, outside the facility, and really being more strategic in terms of those stakeholders that they are working with. And so, again, they were able to tie those collaborative efforts with those stakeholders back to a business risk.
Right.
So, you kind of, it's a double win for them.
Give them that framework to do that. So I think that's really helped in terms of understanding what AWS does and how it can help businesses kind of implementing water stewardship practices. And I want to just switch it a little bit and think about, and specifically, we commissioned some research this summer, really, and what we learned was that Americans want to see businesses contribute more to these water issues. And in particular, one of the things that kind of went to the top of what they would do was adoption of a third-party standard around water stewardship. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on why is AWS relevant, or how does it provide value to businesses and consumers, and some best practices based on kind of your experience so far?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ground to cover in that question, but yeah. I kind of want to go back to the genesis of the Alliance for Water Stewardship and the group of organizations that were really involved in the creation of the Alliance. And a couple of our underwriters here at WWF, obviously Nestle Waters and the Nature Conservancy, the Pacific Institute, General Mills, some other companies. It was a really unique combination of the private sector, NGO groups, or even some government groups and some economic development groups out of Europe that were highly involved in the development of the standard. So one of the values, for businesses participating with AWS and implementing this standard is it enjoys this credibility, this wide credibility and buy-in from all these different groups that are involved in water stewardship issues, right? So it wasn't just created by a single company for a single purpose or a single issue in a single country. It really had this broad view that we need to do something, develop a more coherent approach around water stewardship. So that's one of the business values. Now, obviously, again, since water is so hyper-local and businesses use water in different ways, businesses are going to get a different value depending on where they're located and depending on what they're producing from the Alliance for Water Stewardship. So I think it is good to reinforce the fact that it's not just a standard for sites and companies that are in water-scarce regions. It's equally useful in the Great Lakes as it is in California, as it is in Arizona, as it is anywhere in North America or globally, because it is a global standard. So just in terms of some of the best practices that we're really seeing out there, I think one of the leave behind or takeaway messages for the audience and people who are following along online and otherwise is that we have a lot of work to do, and I mean we, the collective, we have a lot of work to do to really educate consumers and other businesses and other groups that aren't really thinking about water, how water impacts us every day, right? Not many of us woke up this morning here in the New York area and were surprised when we turned on the tap water and water came out. Probably none of us were surprised that we had hot showers last night or this morning. That's a miracle of modern science that we really don't think too often about what's coming out of the tap. And so one of the things that AWS really seeks to do in partnership is really just begin educating people that we're surrounded by water stress. We've heard about climate change and the importance of resiliency with the waterfront here in New York. I'll take it back to the Great Lakes again. Major water quality related issues in the Great Lakes, and you get just outside the basin in the Mississippi Basin, major issues with scarcity and replenishment of aquifers. So again, I think it's really important that we just kind of take this back home, whether it's to our communities, whether it's to our businesses, whether it's to our residences, and just understand where we're sourcing water from, how much we're paying for it, how we're using it, and then what are sort of the risks and the issues that are associated with that.
Sure.
But really one of the unique things about AWS and addressing freshwater issues is we have to do it together. And so there are a lot of opportunities out there around addressing our freshwater resources. And AWS is really pushing companies to work in that collaborative manner. And so to get to your question on best practices, there's a really great group in California that of course, Nestle Waters is involved in called the California Water Action Collaborative. And it's made up of a number of food and beverage companies, other companies, NGO groups that are local to California, but some national groups like WWF and the Nature Conservancy. And what this group does in California is they identify freshwater issues and challenges that are impacting the operations of these businesses, but are also impacting, obviously, the habitat and the freshwater resources of California. And then they agree as a group to work together in sort of a pre-competitive manner to address those issues, to address those freshwater challenges, thereby doing what, right? Creating value for the entire community. And I'll end my question by going back to beer. One of the things that Miller Coors says is no water, no beer. And no water, no New York City, right? I mean, it's that existential.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. That had multiple layers to it, and I think one of them was the call to action, right? And I just would love to just maybe hear from another perspective if there's another thing on the call to action. But we have a very diverse group here in the audience. So, is there anything else that you'd like to add in terms of what would you say is the call to action related to AWS or any of the best practices, something you've seen that's worked really well in terms of a collaborative effort?
Yeah, I mean, again, we just can't take for granted the fact that we have water and that we expect to have it whenever we need it here in North America. And so again, we just have to get out of this mindset that it's always going to be here, it's always going to be cheap and and readily available. And all of us can do something. Again, whether it's in an official capacity with where we work or where we live, we can get involved. And so I guess it's the same call to action. Get involved and just understand what the water challenges and stresses are that are related to your situation where you live, where you work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Valeria.
Very much. Yeah, fantastic.
Next up, please welcome David Hertz, winner of the Water Abundance X Prize, here to speak about making water from air.
Great, good morning. Nice to be here from Malibu, California. It's nice to have a breath of fresh air where, the recent IPP study talked about an ecological genocide, and I have to say 83% of our Santa Monica Mountains is black and white, and it's quite evident. So it's nice to have a little bit of fresh air here. We're very interested in the air, and I'm an architect for the last 30 years. I've been interested in the sustainability, but moving more towards regenerative architecture, buildings that give back more than they actually take. And we can't do it with water. In California, with a sustained drought, we have not been able to solve water. We can collect it, which is great, but we get a lot of water in a short amount of time. And I began to be fascinated with the atmosphere and what we can do. When we look at Earth's water, most of it is salt water. We have a little bit of frozen water. We have 0.77% of water on the planet is fresh. It's geographically distributed. A lot of it is underground. And so when you start to look up rather than down and you look at atmospheric water vapor, it's fascinating. There's more water in the atmosphere at any given time in a vapor form than all the rivers on Earth. About 37.5 million billion gallons. That's 16 zeros. It's a lot of water that is all over. And it's renewable on a weekly basis. You can't extract too much because nature abhors a vacuum. And we can harness it. And that's what I began to be interested in, is atmospheric water generation, as alluded to, as a part of a strategy for a hyper-local contextual response. The UN came out with a recent study that said that water demand will outstrip supply by over 40% by 2030. 2/3 of the world's population will face water scarcity. This, we all know here in this room, is a major issue facing mankind. And we need to come from, rather than scarcity, I think, from abundance. And maybe, as Peter Diamandis' book, Abundance, talked about, maybe it's our ingenuity as we advance that we haven't fully harnessed to be able to use new technologies. And so that's what I began to be fascinated with. What if a building actually can produce its own water? What if it can do it locally on site rather than a large infrastructure. We know infrastructure is wonderful. We heard this morning how antiquated it is. What if we have a more resilient strategy that's based upon redundancy and keeping it hyper-local at the building itself? Now, basically how it works is most of them use the vapor compression cycle to take air, filter that air, no matter how dirty it is, condense it when hot meets cold to create condensation, collect it, treat it, in some cases with ozone, much like bottled water, to preserve it, filter it, and you have drinking water. It's distilled, non-mineralized water. You could add water to it as needed. So what I've been interested in doing is using this in this one process called Skywater, using it in remote conditions, as well as urban conditions. My architecture firm is in Venice Beach, California. I make 150 gallons a day at my building. I use solar energy to provide that energy, and I don't need 150 gallons of water. I decided to give it away to the community. In the little silver there in the urn, I incorporated street art, made a bottle filling station for our large homeless community, but anyone. So it's about the democratization of water as our common good, not the commodification of it as a product. And we not only provide water for the community for free in a bottle filling station, we use a nonprofit that uses kids aged out of the foster care program in a program called Safe Place for Youth, and we water 80 urban farm boxes in Venice that otherwise would not be adopted because, of course, the drought. So when the Water Abundance X Prize was announced, and I was part of the visioning committee of the built environment about 4 years ago that suggested that maybe we should look at this as a nascent technology. We were very, very enthusiastic about joining. 2,000 liters of water per day, 100% renewable energy at less than 2 cents per liter. There were 98 teams from 27 countries. We weren't even in the race in the first one. We got re-entered into the race and we won. As the only one that was made. We made about 2,100 liters at about 0.5 cents per liter using 100% renewable energy. And we used a system approach to do that. We decided that our energy source based on the energy density would be biomass gasification, where we take organic matter like wood chips, of which we have abundance of, or agricultural waste like rice husk or corn cobs, and it's not combustion, it's a partial combustion process to essentially vaporize that in a chamber that captures that heat and humidity, creates mass amounts of energy in a small footprint, and then condense that. The byproduct is biochar. Biochar absorbs atmospheric CO2 and sequesters it and puts it into the ground as a beneficial soil nutrient. And so it's systems thinking. The vision is this we call it. It's wood to energy deployed emergency water. The 4 symbols are earth, air, fire, and water. And we imagine it to be in an intermodal shipping container that can be deployable and resilient. Within 2 weeks of doing our X Prize test in Berkeley, California, we put it in a shipping container. You see the gasifier, the interstitial environment where we create our own essentially tropical environment with heat recovery and then atmospheric water generation. And we powered the Verge conference and the Oakland Convention Center with our own microgrid and provided water for the conference. And so what we are excited about doing is moving to productization. We envision this as part of a climate resilience, self-reliance, and disaster relief model that creates its own environment. So it's agnostic as to local climate, makes water, makes energy. It's a byproduct refrigeration, could house communications, and we're starting to look at rolling these out to those that need water the most. And so that's kind of where we are right now with that, and we thank you so much for having us join you. Thank you.
For a conversation about the future of Flint, please welcome the Mayor of Flint, Karen Weaver, and Little Miss Flint, Mari Kopany. Leading the conversation is Kathleen Koch.
Oh, welcome, ladies. I am so excited to be here with two of Flint's best-known water warriors, right? So, Mayor, I'd like to start with you. It's been 3 years now since, I think it's pretty safe to say that the country as a whole was shocked to hear that your city, your citizens, had been drinking for more than a year water that was a year and a half, right? Yes. Lead contaminated. When the source of your water was switched to the Flint River. Talk to us about how things are going now. How is it going replacing these lead service pipes?
You know, and that was our goal, because for 18 months before the rest of the country found out we were drinking lead-poisoned water, we knew something was wrong. So we were really glad when the media got a hold of that and let people know what was going on in the city of Flint. As a result, we had 18 to 20,000 pipes that had been identified as high priority that needed to get addressed, either make sure they were copper to copper, or if they were lead or galvanized, get replaced. And so we decided that we were going to do that over a 3-year period. That was our goal, 6,000 pipes each year for 3 years.
How's that going?
And it's going, actually it's going really, really well, and we are very much ahead of schedule. We have less than 150 pipes to look at. So if the weather holds out in Flint, Michigan, we could get done by the end of the year, but we know we'll be done before the end of next year. So that's a wonderful thing for us.
Mari, tell us about how you found out that your water in Flint was contaminated. I mean, you were, I guess, 7 when this started, right? What did you notice first?
I noticed that the water smelled very, very, very bad, like it smelled like bleach, and that my little sister had got a very bad rash to the point where we had to put this special lotion on her and then wrap her inside this special plastic wrap because her skin was really breaking out really, really, really bad.
And so you, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, I'm just a kid. What can I do about this? But you decided you could do something, and you said, hey, Mom, I want to go to this congressional hearing 12 hours away in Washington. And then you wrote the president to say, hey, I'm coming. And then he reaches out to you later and says, well, I think I'm going to come to Flint, Mari, and I'm going to meet you. I mean, what did you think about that?
I was amazed. Like, I was just in total shock. Because when we, okay, so like, am I allowed to tell you this? But like,
tell me what.
Okay, so when I was at the 3rd grade, I see my mom walking down the hallway. I thought, oh, she's probably just coming to watch me or coming to pick me up or something like that. And she walked to my classroom. Then all I see is these camera people coming behind her, and I'm like, okay, what's going on? And then she was like, you're not gonna believe this, but President wants to come and meet you. And that's when they all started rushing in, and that's when everybody started like, oh my gosh! And that's when I was like,
Wow. Well, so he came and visited. Did his visit help? Did it help Flint?
It kind of did.
How? What happened? What was different after that?
I mean, nothing. Okay, some things have changed, but some haven't.
What's changed?
That the state isn't giving out free water anymore.
Oh. You're worried about that? Let me ask the mayor about that. I know that's something the state stopped back in June, but let's talk in general about this relationship, or shall I say face-off you're having currently with the state. I mean, in October, they issued a consent order basically kind of trying to take over the operation of your water system. They said that they have unresolved, they said the water quality is doing better and fine, and right? They praised that, but they said they have concerns with unresolved, quote, long-term technical and managerial issues. Help us understand what's going on.
That's what they said, and that was really interesting to me. I said, because you put us in this situation, and then you want to punish us for the situation you put us in, and I'm not signing any water back over to the state. So we've been fussing about that, and It's been interesting. It's been interesting whether it's been about that, and they're saying how we have not been in compliance with certain things. And I said, wow. I said, how do you blame us for the situation? I said, that's like saying you took my clothes and then you want to arrest me for indecent exposure. I said, that's what you're doing. I said, and that is not going to happen. We have been in compliance. Tell me where we haven't, and they have not been able to do that. When
What
we
about
get behind
they took
closed
issue
doors.
with one of the method that you're using,
The
I
method
guess,
we're
to
using, yes.
correct the pipes, because they say it's too expensive and it's not as accurate as
And
a
you know
method you were
what?
using in the past.
You're right. And when they say too expensive, I get angry all over again, because that's what got us in this situation. They put cost over the health and well-being of a community of 100,000 people. And that's how we got here, because they figured we weren't worth $100 a day for corrosion control. That's what got us in this mess. And so they wanted, and they're using Flint as a model for the rest of the state as far as changing lead and galvanized pipes. And so hydro excavation is it's less expensive and it's quicker. But one
Hydro
of the things,
excavation is
open up a hole. Right. And so what happened was we'd open up a hole and you look and you say, oh, that's a copper pipe, you can leave it. And they'd mark it CC, copper to copper.
And it was 2 by 3, so
right.
it wasn't a big hole.
And one of the contractors didn't see that and opened it up and found out that was where they had repaired it, and it was really a lead service line. And that's why we said, wait a minute. So when we went back, we found we were missing homes.
So now you're doing 8 by 10.
So we're
holes.
doing.
I mean, that's a big hole. Okay.
Exactly, because the plumbers have told us that are out there saying you're going to miss some doing hydro excavation. So we had a street that was identified in a newer neighborhood. They said this block should be copper to copper. We checked. 7 of the homes in a row were copper to copper, and then we had 3 that weren't. And one of the things we said is every life in the city of Flint is important. If we're going to get the lead out, let's do it right. If it costs more, too bad, because we can put a cost on infrastructure. People have said, what does it cost? We can always put a cost on infrastructure, but we can't put a cost on the lives of the people and the toll that this has taken, whether it's been kids and pregnant women that have been exposed to the lead and drinking the lead poisoned water, whether it's the lives we've lost as a result of Legionnaires, whether we're talking about the number of women that have had miscarriages and stillbirths during that time of the water switch. And so I am not willing to do a quick and cheap fix.
Mari, how's it going with the water in Flint now? Are you drinking it? Is everybody bathing in it? How do you feel about it? Nope.
No, I haven't told anybody to drink the water yet.
Had to ask. Okay.
No.
All right.
Because one of the things I said is I'm not signing off on the water yet. So while we're changing pipes, the water's testing good, one of the things the EPA has said is while you have this amount of construction going on, you still have a public health issue. And so we are to stay on bottled and filtered water until we get through this and our health community signs off. So I know she wasn't going to say she was drinking the water.
But things are better. Tell me how things are better then. You can take a bath in it, right? Shower in it. Can you cook with it? Right?
No, you can't cook.
You can't? Okay.
You gotta use bottled water. You can take a shower in it, but it can't be like for long. It'd be like 2 or 3 minutes. Then you have to get out. You can't really take a bath inside of it. Only if you want to take a bath, then you have to get jugs of water, warm them up, and then drag them all the way upstairs or wherever your bathtub is, and then pour the water inside your bathtub if you want to take a bubble bath or just a bath.
So it's still a lot of work, even though things are better. It's not fixed yet. But you've made a lot of progress. How do you feel about the difference? I mean, you've been able to make, you have really become a nationally known figure through this. I mean, I know you have more Twitter followers than me. That's for sure. And you have to read what it says. Her Twitter description reads, activist, philanthropist, future president?
Uh-huh.
All right, fill us in on that. Fill us in. What's going on? You've declared? What year? What are we looking at?
2044.
2044. All right. You heard it here first. How does that make you feel? Well, I mean, I guess what I'm saying, kids can make a difference. A lot of people think, even grown-ups think, hey, I'm just one person. What can I do? And what do you tell people? One person. What? What do you tell other kids who think they can't make a difference?
That they can change the world.
Yeah, because you are, huh? And Mayor, I wanted to ask you about that because, in a way, what's happened in Flint is changing the world, at least in the United States. Since the incident in Flint, since the water contamination, the GAOs found that in 2016 and 2017, 43% of the schools in our country have had their lead tested, and 37% found elevated lead. I mean, your city's been through hell, but you've really opened the eyes of the country to this crisis, and maybe you're saving lives.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. One of the things I've said is it's sad, but it's true that we can't take our water quality standards for granted. And people have to question. You know, we have to, and that's what we've learned. We've also learned the value of maintaining and investing in infrastructure because we've got this aging infrastructure all across our country. And I've also said, please don't let us go through this crisis and not learn from us. You know, use us because we know that we represent so many other cities across this country. So please learn from Flint. Don't have us go through this and you didn't learn anything from what happened. So it makes me feel good that people are questioning, that people are testing because when the state was ready to leave the city of Flint, they had not tested our schools and legally they didn't have a responsibility to. And I said, how can you not test our schools where our kids are? And they wanted to do a one-and-done testing and be gone. And we said, no, we cannot allow that to happen. And so I'm glad that they are paying attention and they are looking at what's going on in their schools because we know that kids are our most vulnerable population when it comes to lead and water. We know that our seniors are. So people are waking up and paying attention. And for that, I'm really, really grateful. But can I say something about Mari, please? Because you were talking about kids can make a difference. And I think I did it I tweeted you, but I wanted to really congratulate her because Ebony recognized her for being a voice for young people, not just for young people in the city of Flint, but all across the country. And one thing we've learned through this water crisis is it doesn't matter if you're young or old. One voice can make a difference. And if people would use their voice, they could really see some change. So I just think that's important to let people know that.
Mari, I heard you using your voice in a recent speech, and I love what you said. You said, nobody seemed to be listening to the adults. I knew that eventually they'd listen to me. Why?
Because adults don't listen to adults very well, and some kids don't listen to kids very well. So what if an adult listened to a kid? So all the adults listen to me.
And why did you know that they would?
Because I'm a kid and that...
Because you were someone really impacted by this, right? You're speaking from experience, huh? Huh? Your voice is special. And before we go to questions, Mayor, I know that even though we saw so many schools now getting their lead treated, you mentioned, you do have to question the quality of your water. And yes. The EPA has found that I think we have still 6.1 million lead service lines in use across the country. So is this really maybe just the tip of the iceberg?
Probably so. Probably so, because that's what we've talked about is Flint is not the only Flint. It really isn't, especially when you do have this aging infrastructure and there has been no investment in it. And if you look at the standards that have been put in place as far as the lead and copper rule, it's old, it's outdated, and that's what people need to look at. We really wanted to get it lower than what it is because it was 15. And we wanted to go, because we know no lead is good lead, is a good amount, and we wanted to go lower. The state went to 12, which is the lowest, and we're thinking 12, that's the lowest. This is really sad. So that's what we have to be about, and we have to use our voice to push that issue and have people look at that. It's because it is the tip of the iceberg. I do believe that. I do believe that.
All right, let's go to questions from the audience, and if you would, do we have one back here? All right, stand up and tell us who you are, please.
Hey there, I'm Zach Sadow from Barclays. Thank you both for being here. Mayor, could you talk about if there's any change in the appetite for private investment and water infrastructure in Flint?
If there's any change for
Investor appetite?
investor appetite. What do you-
Private investment. He said private investment in
Infrastructure.
in the infrastructure.
the infrastructure for the entire city of Flint? Is that what you mean?
Water infrastructure and
Water-
related infrastructure as well.
Well, right now I can tell you what we're doing is we're always looking to see how, who we can work with, who we can partner with. I do want to say that. Right, and that's what our next move will be, to look at what we do, because right now, like I said, we wanted to make sure we got all of those identified lead service lines, but then after we finish those, we want to move to the rest of the infrastructure throughout the entire city of Flint, because one thing we know is that in its heyday, Flint was over 200,000 people, and we have an infrastructure that was built for 250,000 plus people because General Motors was there. And so now we do have an opportunity to right-size the infrastructure, and looking at how we're going to make that happen is what we're doing right now.
More questions? Over here.
Hi, I want to thank you both for coming today and having this conference with the Atlantic. I have two related questions. One, a speaker earlier talked about market forces and bad governance as part of the problem in the global south with water issues. How would you respond to that criticism when it comes to the U.S. in your situation, understanding that you've been told that you need to price the water correctly? The second question is, how has your relationship changed with one of the sponsors of this event, which is Nestle, in regards to their pumping of groundwater at no additional cost while you're still trying to find good water for young children like the ones next to you today?
Ask me the
interesting question.
What was the first?
The first one
was about the cost of water.
Market forces and bad governance as it relates to us versus the global south.
You know
Because
what?
the people of Flint currently pay, and I guess
That, and you know what? That's
pay the highest.
right, and
price
that's
for
what our water
in the
issue
country,
was
right?
at first. When this issue first started, our water issue was the cost, and because we were paying 8 times the national average, so that was how this all started. Was the cost of water, and then we started finding out that there was bacteria in the water, and then the switch happened, and then lead was in the water. But that was exactly what was going on, and that's what we're looking at now, because, and that's what part of our fight was. We were still paying 8 times the national average, and we were paying for poisoned water at that time.
Paying to who you paying the bill to is to the state?
I mean, it's the bill goes to the city of Flint.
City, okay.
It was state oversight, and we knew that our water rates had been raised illegally because we had emergency managers that had taken over the city of Flint, and that had been in place for 6 years before I got into office. And one of the things with emergency managers is they're really not looking at bringing revenue into the city. They're not looking at opportunities for economic growth for the city. They're looking to cut, and they're putting cost above everything. And so that's what we were fighting for, and we're still fighting about that, and that's what we're looking at is ways to be able to reduce that. And it's interesting because one of the things you're talking about government, the state really wanted us to go up on our water bill. They still wanted us to go up. We were having that conversation, and that's been another one of the fights we've been having with the state as far as we're not going to raise the water bill. Are you kidding me? We're just getting back to a place where we're getting the pipes changed and the water is testing better, but we know that the infrastructure, the plumbing in the homes is still an issue, and it's a challenge. And so we have people whose homes will still test high for lead because the in-home plumbing has been damaged. We're fighting them to get them to pay for that because they only replaced 4,000 that first year, and they have not lived up to their responsibility there. So that's something that we're always looking at, water rates and how we can, right now we've maintained them, but if there is a way for us to even go down on those water rates, that's what we're looking at. And we've been meeting with different people and different agencies, and even the philanthropic community has come in to say, how can we work together to make sure this does not continue, and it certainly cannot go up in the city of Flint.
Did you have thoughts on the second aspect of his question about Nestle?
So to the author's question before, you're saying that market forces don't always correct for everyone.
No.
And did you want to answer the second part of his
Second
question about
was
Nestle?
About Nestle. Well, you know what? I know there's been that issue, and I've kind of stayed out of that. They've said, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? But
It's 120 miles away where they're getting the water.
But one thing I do have to acknowledge is the state pulled out on us. The state told us they were going to keep those help centers open for us until we got through this lead service line replacement, and they didn't. They stood in front of our community and said that this would happen. They knew that the EPA was not going to lift this ban, and they took away the bottled water from the citizens of the people of Flint. And so when we did need those help centers to stay open, that was who came and is continuing to keep the help centers open for the residents of the city of Flint. I told them, I said, and they're in a tough spot. It's a tough spot to be in because you are going to take criticism for that. And people would say, well, you should be, they should be giving the people of the city of Flint water. Well, when they are giving the people of the city of Flint water, you're getting criticized as well. And you know what my goal and my responsibility is not that. My responsibility is to be about the people, get the people the resources that we need and that we deserve as a result of what happened. And so that's where I stay focused. I have to stay focused on what I was elected to do and what my role is. And it's to be the voice for the people and making sure we get everything that we deserve as a result of what happened.
Mayor, before we go, I did want to ask you, how long do you think it will be? Can you give us a prediction when people will be able to drink the water that comes out of the taps in Flint, Michigan?
Well, you know what? We've been told by the state we can drink it now. I'm not buying that because, like I said, I know the EPA has said while you have this going on, you still have a public health risk. And so I want all of the pipes changed, and then the pipes that have been said to be copper to copper, I want to check just to make sure, because they told me this other block was going to be copper to copper, and we found 3 that weren't. So I want to make sure we get those 18,000 that were identified out of the way, and then I want to check the rest of the city of Flint because we got to get rid of this, and we want our public health community, our physicians, our scientists, our people that we trust to give us the okay, and then I'll sign off. So when that happens, it'll be a big announcement.
Trust is another victim of this crisis. And Mari, we'll give you the last word. What would you like to tell the people of the country about water and the importance of it and having clean water?
That Flint isn't alone and that there's other states and countries that have bad water just like us, or even higher levels of probably lead water, like really, really, really dirty water.
All right. Well, I hope, Mari, you'll be able to take a bubble bath really soon. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mayor Weaver.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Okay, we're going to go this.
To discuss the global state of drinking water, please welcome Gary White, CEO and co-founder of Water.org, and Kelly Ann Naylor, Global Chief of Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene at UNICEF. Leading the conversation is Steve Clemens, the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Mic on. Mic is not on. You guys hear me? A little bit. Okay, great. That's better. I've been thinking about this and watching much of this morning's session and thinking about, Gary, your organization was founded almost 28 years ago. Kellyanne, you're kind of global head of water for all cool UN stuff. And when I get into a subject like this, I wonder why, given 3 decades of work and given the power and stage that you have in the United Nations, has this been such an in-depth? Why have we failed so long to put this issue to bed? And when you're thinking about water for all, I mean, it's just, are we going to be discussing this 30 years from now? Gary?
I hope not. I think, with the SDG 6, people are rallying around it.
You don't sound optimistic.
So, I am. I am optimistic. And I think that for me, it's great that this session's happening in the first place, Steve, to take this to the global level, because it is just this immense problem. And I think that what we're trying to do with water.org and water equity is to take a step back, because this, the system overall is kind of a mess, and it's not serving the people that it needs to serve, and it's not sustainable. Yet at water.org, what we're saying is we're going to look at it from the lens of the poor. Right? So regardless of the state of the system now, there are things we can do today to help level the playing field so that the world's poor can get access.
Like, not to overstate it, we've had a lot of global poor for a long time.
But here's why we should be optimistic.
Challenge, the Millennium Development Goals. I'm just sort of want us to grade ourselves that if we continue in a status quo way, this seems to me never to be solved. So what are the needles that you can push to actually get us into a place where you feel like we're tipping in the right direction?
Well, why should we be optimistic, right? So we should, because in the last 2 decades, 2 billion people have come out of extreme poverty. One of the first things that they want is access to water and sanitation improvements. And the world's poor are already paying coping costs, right? The coping cost associated without having access to water, how much time they're spent walking for water, and how do you monetize that time, the amount that people spend on water vendors, which is usually 10 to 15 times more per liter than somebody who has a tap, the health consequences, this adds up to between $200 and $300 billion a year. And so what we're doing is trying to get those coping costs channeled in a way that's much more efficient, so people can get small loans so that they can have access to the level playing field. Right now, they can't get connected to the utilities because they can't afford the connection fees. They can afford to pay a water vendor $1 a day, but they can't afford the $230 it takes to connect to the system. And so what we've done is mobilized $1 billion in capital through our partners to make small loans to people so that they can get access to water supplies.
So that's one of the new things you're bringing. Kellyanne, how about on your front? I know you deal not just with water, but sanitation in much of the developing world. I mean, I'm truly so impressed with the portfolio that you represent. But I just to kind of cut to the chase, what are the game-changing things you think that your institution in partnership with others can do that just sort of breaks the mold of sort of always doing philanthropy, in a sense? I mean, we always want to do philanthropy, but just to be just blunt, I don't want to do water events 5 years from now and 10 years from now.
Thanks so much. And I think we share the same ambition that this is a problem that we can address within this development agenda up to 2030. I think, we have made great progress, I think, to be fair. It's just that the bar is moving. And I think some of the issues that we faced with population growth, for example, where I was recently working in West and Central Africa, over the time that we had the Millennium Development Goals, the population doubled. And so this, puts us always in that we're always chasing a moving goalpost. The other one is, of course, also with urbanization and variation and changes in climate. So these are some of the factors that we have to tackle them. We have to get ahead of this curve. And I think in addition to maybe some of the areas where we're working on trying to improve the governance, regulation, we're also looking at how private sector can play a bigger role. And so UNICEF has been working on the new market shaping strategy to see how we can use our close relationship with government, the work we do with populations to aggregate that demand to be more attractive for investment. And the types of things that Gary's talking about is that this has not been an attractive sector. It's been seen as a money loser. And so we're trying to look at how do we turn it around to make the sector more credible and more ready to attract private sector investment.
Do you think we need a crisis? I don't know if this has come up earlier in the day, but I know when we were discussing earlier the question of whether, a dam failing or, we just had Flint, Michigan up here, which was, a microcosm of what could be a larger crisis. But it makes me wonder sometimes, do you need, and I suppose, if you look at Sudan or other places, maybe the crises are already out there but not felt or acknowledged. But do we need a crisis for rich people in urban areas so that they have a sense of the drama of this?
Well, I mean, I think this recent situation in Cape Town shows us that the crisis is already here. And so we've been working in a number of countries. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting in the Middle East with all of the representatives of UNICEF looking at the fact that the crisis is here. We have a number of countries that are looking at this day zero scenario because they're over-extracting their aquifers. And the rate of extraction of aquifers is outpacing the replenishment of these resources. areas. And so, I mean, we're looking at these scenarios where we have time limits where we can get to where we know that that resource is going to be stressed. And we're already seeing also with the refugee populations that this is overstressing the situation in countries, for example, like Jordan. And this can create wider problems in terms of children and people on the move, as well as inter-country and inter-community conflicts. So I think it's something that's already on the radar screen.
Gary, you work and you've got a celebrity pal, Matt Damon, who hangs out with you guys now and then. And I'm interested in whether you think those sorts of partnerships help, I don't know, win over, seduce other people to think about this and prioritize it in ways that they wouldn't otherwise do, and what the limits of that thinking are as well.
Yeah, no, it certainly helps, and I think, you know, to Matt's credit, he isn't a spokesperson for Water.org and Water Equity. He's a co-founder, right? So we merged our organizations in 2009, and now he's literally one of the world's water experts. And he shows up with me at Davos, at the World Bank, and wherever, and can hold his own. I think it's that type of level of commitment of a celebrity getting into a cause and being very focused that is extremely helpful for us. And I think to get back to the crisis question, if, you know, a child dying every 90 seconds from water-related disease isn't a crisis, I don't know what is. And I think that's the key to this, that this crisis, we talked a lot, and we have talked a lot about existential threats of water. It's not an existential threat. It is a death, right? Death is happening right now today because of this. These people aren't thinking about a looming crisis. This is happening to them today. And I think, again, but the good news is, and I'm glad that, you know, you, Kelly, talked about finance as well and made it a priority at UNICEF, because there's not going to be enough charity in the world to get water to everybody. But the good news is the poor are really willing to meet us halfway from a market-based approach. So we don't see them as a problem to be solved with charity. We see them more as a market to be served. And with our water credit initiative, what we're doing is mobilizing capital so they can get the loans that they need. These loans are repaid at 99% rates, right? About 70% of the people who take them out live on less than $3 a day. So this is the poor kind of showing up and extending a hand to us, actually. If we can extend a hand from the top down by using philanthropy catalytically to correct these market failures, then I think we can get there and we can close this $1 trillion gap that it's going to take to get water and sanitation to everyone.
Let me, you know, maybe I'm just far too cynical and dark, but I am a journalist, you know, and I apologize, folks. I am wondering whether or not these last 3 years are something to worry about, in the sense when I look at the kinds of challenges we have and what you're both doing. You're in trying to get transnational empathy, transnational resources, you know, deal with a major global public goods problem. And this seems to be one of the most selfish eras that I can imagine and remember. Nations cutting off migration, of turning a blind eye to the 80,000 children's deaths in Yemen. And I'm just wondering whether the strategy is just to ignore that surface noise of disregard that's happening at the global level, and that somehow deeper in the roots, you both see things that are going well. So I'd love to get your thoughts about it, because it seems to me, you know, Clinton Global Initiative type stuff is done right now. And so how do you succeed in a world where that kind of institutionalized philanthropy is, you know, kind of withering?
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing is...
How's that for darkness?
Yeah, I'll try to shine a light.
Yeah, good.
So I think, you know, what we're seeing is, I would say, kind of the other side, that we're seeing leadership coming from different places. And like? So India, for example. Okay. So the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, in 2014, decided that for Mahatma Gandhi's 150th birthday celebration, he would bring universal sanitation coverage to India. And so India is a country that has over 500 million people who don't even use a toilet, who are practicing open defecation. And so he decided to show political leadership to mobilize the country around this challenge. So in September, he decided to convene a meeting, and he invited the ministers from over 70 countries. We had 68 country delegations, 55 ministerial delegations, who came to India to talk about how to mobilize political leadership and build South-South cooperation to be able to move the needle on sanitation in their countries. So this is really exciting, where we have a country that was somewhere one of the largest shares of the problem, being a driver of the solution. Wow. And so now I found out just last week, Nigeria, which is a country of almost 200 million people, has now signed a memorandum of understanding with India to learn from that experience and to translate it into the Nigeria context. So these are the types of things where we see this type of political leadership, we see international cooperation happening in a new way. And
is there sort of a show and tell of those kind of things? I mean, that does sound, I mean, you are making me a little more optimistic now, slightly. But I mean, I think that, is there a way in which folks that are doing these sorts of things, because it sort of looks like this, I mean, I'm glad everyone's here today, but it sort of seems like the neglected sector, the underpriced sector, the sector that isn't taken as seriously as energy. So I'm just wondering what can be done to raise the profile of this so that these good practices, best practices, get higher profile.
Yeah, so I mean, we're trying to use a number of regional platforms that UNICEF is engaged with. So in addition to global platforms like the United Nations, where we have SDG 6, which Gary mentioned, we also use the African Union. We have an African Ministers' Council on Water that is convening an Africa Sanitation Conference in February, where UNICEF has been supporting, along with other partners, 55 countries from Africa to develop a baseline understanding of where they are on sanitation and develop roadmaps for how these countries are going to achieve universal basic access to sanitation by 2030. So while we still have a long way to go, we see a huge motivation of countries to address this, because I think there is a growing understanding that we can't have development and prosperity without addressing fundamental issues of sanitation.
Gary, in the social impact investing, which, which I find is not philanthropy. It sometimes accepts lower returns, but people are expecting returns. And it's the good part about it is it creates a sustainability of investment. Do you think you see a way to turn from a $50 million fund, which I know you just secured, into something that has billions of dollars of impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Kelly's talking about from the public sector is a lot's happening on the ground in these governments and these countries to kind of get things ready for more investment. And I think that's so important. But what I see is, in this world, a concentration of wealth that we've never seen before. It's staggering how much wealth has been concentrated in the hands of a few. But I also believe it's never been a greater empathy and willingness to respond to that among the wealthy than we see today, right? So I was at the Giving Pledge, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, gathering of billionaires to sign the pledge. So they invited me in to talk about water and sanitation solutions, and there's real interest there. So I came away from that, and as just one example, one of the members of the Giving Pledge were in the throes of putting together a credit enhancement vehicle. What that basically means is that we can take like $50 million and just have it pledged. So philanthropists don't have to give it away. They can pledge that money. We can leverage that up probably 10 to 20 times with financial institutions in India who just need a little bit more of the edge taken off the risk to make $1 billion in loans, right? So I think that we see this ability so much that we actually created a new entity called Water Equity, which is an impact investment fund manager. And what it does, you mentioned our fund, we just closed around 50 million. And what that'll mean is about 4 million people get access to water and sanitation by us deploying that capital over a period of 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, investors get their funds back. In the meantime, they get a targeted financial return on that. So Bank of America came into this, right? OPIC came into this, Skoll Foundation, the Hilton Foundation, others. So this bridges to the private sector as well, because what the private sector sees by coming to water.org and trying to tackle this crisis is every dollar of philanthropy that they put in, we're able to take that, correct the market failure, and leverage about $45 of capital going to help people get water and sanitation.
I want to go to the audience a second, but let me just ask you both real quickly. When we were discussing this as well previously, but I'm interested in whether or not there are ways to reward innovation in the water and sanitation area that we may not be thinking about, or given what we've just seen of fires in California or the climate change dynamic, a way to bring mayors or governors in the United States together, or maybe world leaders together around water in ways that haven't happened before. Is that on them? Maybe it's happening and I'm unaware of it, but is that sort sort of thing on your roadmaps, just very briefly?
Yeah, so there's a global partnership for water and sanitation called the Sanitation and Water for All Partnership, which is a multi-stakeholder platform that brings together governments, private sector, and civil society organizations that is, trying to kind of elevate the question of water and sanitation. I think we're also trying to look at how we can reward innovation, as you said, and one of the things that UNICEF is trying is looking at partnering with private sector. So this is new for us. I mean, we've tended to have relationships with private sector companies as service deliverers or implementers, and now we're experimenting with approaches like shared value partnerships. And so, for example, we've just signed one recently with Lixil, which is the world's largest toilet manufacturer. It owns brands like American Standard and Grohe, and they develop a $5 million toilet, but they've decided that they want to go to market with a $5 toilet component that can be available on those markets. And so this is where we're trying to use our demand aggregation to bring this to the field.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue, right? Because again, this demand is out there. It's overwhelming among the poor. I mean, they want a nice toilet. They want a water connection. And so these small businesses and enterprises are responding to that. But what we see is they're starved for capital, right? So what we've done with water equity is we're not only just investing in funds that bring microloans to household level people, but we're investing in those types of enterprises that are serving the base of the pyramid needs.
How much money do you need so we don't have to do this topic in 10 years?
$1 trillion.
$1 trillion. Well, $1 trillion
not
is,
us,
but
the sector.
Yeah, but I mean, so that's interesting about a price tag. So $1 trillion is sometimes it's useful to put that aggregate number up there to sort of look
but
at
right
what
now,
was
only if you sum up all of the development assistance going into this, all the charity, all the investment, writ large, it's less than a third of that right now each year. So there is a huge gap to be closed.
Well, thank you both for those insights. Let me go to the audience right here in the front, and then we have a gentleman over here too.
My name is Dr. Arnold Wendroff, and my interest in this began in 1967 and 8 as a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, and I have longitudinal experience. And unfortunately, I have to sort of pillory the development community, including UNICEF, because you have totally ignored the need for wheeled transport. And the photo that our air extraction guy showed had his very high-tech container of technology and African women carrying the water in buckets on their head. Now, all of you are old enough, as am I, to remember the bad old days before the invention and commercialization of wheel luggage. The bottom line is that you're talking about disseminated populations in India and Africa. There is no economic way to supply them with piped water. But if they had little carts, as we say in the States, garden carts, your wheel luggage are exemplars that can be built for about $30 each. You will have solved a major problem, not merely in water, but in every other transport need.
Thank you for the comment.
Some literature to show you. Think about it.
Thank you for the comment. We're going to take, is it Anthony? Or no, yeah, right here. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi, I'm Dan Benna, and when I was at PepsiCo, I had the good fortune of helping bring Water.org and Safe Water Network and Earth Institute into PepsiCo, and Gary, you're a remarkable partner. I can't help but think we're 10 blocks away from the United Nations headquarters.
Right.
This year is the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. And in addition, they explicitly recognized water as a human right. And from my perspective, that has all but vanished from a lot of the sectoral discourse. My question to both of you is that okay? And if it's not, what can we do about it?
So let me ask you both to respond to both the comment here about are we not mismatching how we're thinking about getting people the resources and tools that might actually really help them, and then what are we doing with this as a right that seems to have eroded from consciousness? Kellyanne.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. And I think this is a really important point because, I mean, it is well established in international law around the issues of the access to the right to water, first in 2010, that looked at the right to water and sanitation. And then most recently in 2015, we have the right to sanitation being recognized. I think that what is important about this is that these are recognized as being rights that have been progressively achieved. And we've been trying trying to kind of work on the ground to figure out how we can do it in a way that can kind of, like you said, be taken as a goal that we can work towards. But I think you're right that the need to really embed this in the constitutions of countries is something that we've been working on, and it is something where we're starting to see progress. But this is also where civil society is also a driver of change.
Is it in any constitution now?
Yeah, so there's a number of countries, I don't have the name right offhand, but there are a couple countries where I know that it's been formally recognized, and we've been working with them on a pathway to implementing that. But it is something that is important for embedding this into national rules and regulations.
Interesting. Gary?
What I think is important about it, too, is that the way we couch it at water.org is there absolutely is a human right to safe, sustainable, and affordable water, right? So much of the conversation, I remember Seth up here earlier talking about we just don't price water properly. And so all those signals to people in terms of how they use it are just completely distorted. And so what we have to do is price water appropriately while also providing a cross-subsidization in the tariff structure so that the people who are the poorest can get access to that basic amount of water that they need, and then you can price the other accordingly. So I think we have to always keep that affordable kind of clause in there, because we're already starved for capital. If we all of a sudden say everybody has right to human right to water for free, then we're just going to dig ourselves even deeper into the hole.
You know, I just want to say that, you know, we have colleagues at Atlantic Media Company at courts, and they sometimes write about things as obsessions versus those who just dabble in things. So I want to thank you for both being so obsessed with the Global Water Challenge. So big round of applause for Gary White and Kellyanne Naylor. Thank you both so much. Real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
Thank you. This way. But that's fine. You know what? Yeah, I know you were. I know you were. Thank you, Gary, Kellyanne, Steve. Thank you to our speakers and moderators today. Water, I think, is indeed a vast topic, and I think we cracked the surface on some of the most pressing issue, and clearly there's a lot more ground to cover, and we will continue to follow this closely. I hope all of you who came today leave here having learned something new, inspired by an idea that you heard or somebody that you met. My thanks to our underwriters once again, Nestle Waters North America and the World Wildlife Fund, for making this urgent conversation possible. And mostly my thanks to all of you. I know how precious all of your time is. So thank you for giving so much of it to us. Let's give you a round of applause. I have one last request before you go, which is that all of you on your tables or chairs or in an email from me momentarily will get a brief survey about what you saw and heard today. And if you would take a moment to fill it out, we would be enormously grateful. It really informs how we do our work and how we make it better each and every time. Have a wonderful day. Stay warm, and see you next time.